The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle as tourists gathered for the final ceremonial duties of the day. Among the crowd was Viktor Petrov, a wealthy Russian businessman in his mid-40s who had come to England as part of a luxury tour package that promised exclusive access to Britain's most prestigious locations. Viktor wore an expensive Italian suit and carried himself with the arrogant confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through money and intimidation. Viktor had made his fortune through questionable business dealings in Moscow, including construction contracts that often involved corruption and the exploitation of workers who had little choice but to accept dangerous conditions for minimal pay. His wealth had insulated him from consequences for most of his adult life, and he had developed a deep contempt for what he saw as the weakness and politeness of Western societies, particularly the British with their traditions and ceremonies, that he considered outdated and foolish. Standing at his ceremonial post near the castle entrance was Lance Corporal James MacLeod, a 26-year-old member of the Scots Guards who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq before, earning his position with the elite unit responsible for royal protection duties. James came from a working-class family in Glasgow. His thick Scottish accent carried the warmth and strength of his Highland heritage, though it sometimes made communication challenging with tourists from different countries. James had grown up in one of Glasgow's toughest neighborhoods. His father worked in the shipyards, and his mother cleaned office buildings to make ends meet. Military service had provided him with opportunities his family could never have afforded, and he took enormous pride in representing both his country and his Scottish heritage through his service with the Guards. His accent was a source of personal pride, connecting him to generations of ancestors who had fought for Scotland and Britain. The ceremonial duties at Windsor Castle required guards to interact with tourists more frequently than those at Buckingham Palace, often providing directions or answering basic questions about the castle's history and operations. James had learned to speak slowly and clearly when addressing foreign visitors, understanding that his accent could sometimes be difficult for non-native English speakers to understand. But he never compromised the authenticity of his speech. Patterns Viktor had been wandering around the castle grounds for over an hour, complaining loudly to his tour guide about various aspects of the experience that failed to meet his expectations. He had criticized the size of the rooms, the quality of the refreshments, and the speed of the guided tours, making his dissatisfaction known to anyone within earshot. His behavior had already drawn annoyed looks from other tourists who were trying to enjoy their visit. The confrontation began when Viktor approached James to ask for directions to the gift shop, speaking in heavily accented English that revealed his Russian origins. James responded politely and helpfully, providing clear directions while maintaining the professional demeanor expected of Royal Guard personnel. His Scottish accent was particularly pronounced that day, perhaps due to fatigue from a long shift, or simply the natural variation that occurred in anyone's speech patterns. Viktor's reaction to James's accent was immediate and insulting. He began laughing loudly and mockingly, making exaggerated attempts to imitate the Scottish pronunciation. While commenting rudely about the guard's intelligence and education, his behavior attracted the attention of nearby tourists, many of whom seemed uncomfortable with the obvious disrespect. Being shown to a member of the military who was simply doing his job, the Russian businessman seemed to find great amusement in what he perceived as James's inferior background and education, making comments that revealed his own prejudices about working-class people and those who chose military service. He spoke loudly enough for other tourists to hear, apparently seeking an audience for his mockery and superiority complex that had been fed by years of wealth and power without accountability. James maintained his composure and professional bearing, despite the obvious insult and disrespect, responding to Viktor's questions with continued politeness while internally struggling with anger and humiliation. His military training had taught him to remain calm under pressure and to represent his unit and country with dignity. Even when faced with provocative behavior from civilians who seemed determined to cause problems, Viktor's mockery intensified. When he realized that James was not going to respond aggressively to his taunts, he began making jokes about Scottish people in general, suggesting that they were backward and uncivilized compared to sophisticated Russians like himself. His comments revealed both cultural ignorance and personal arrogance that had apparently gone unchecked for most of his adult life. Other tourists in the area began to notice the confrontation and react with obvious disapproval to Victor's behavior. Several people made comments about his rudeness, while others moved closer to show support for the guard who was being subjected to unprovoked harassment. The atmosphere in the courtyard began to shift as people recognized that they were witnessing something unpleasant and unfair. James's fellow guards had noticed the situation was developing and were monitoring it carefully while maintaining their own positions and duties. Military protocol prevented them from intervening directly unless the situation escalated to physical confrontation. But they were prepared to support their colleague if necessary. The bonds of brotherhood formed through shared service and training made Victor's attack on James feel personal to all of them. The Russian businessman seemed oblivious to the growing disapproval of the crowd around him, apparently believing that his wealth and status gave him the right to treat others with contempt and disrespect. His behavior suggested that he had rarely faced consequences for his actions, and had little understanding of how his words and attitude affected other people, or reflected on his own character. Victor continued his verbal assault on James, apparently enjoying what he saw as his superiority over a working-class soldier who was required by duty to remain polite and professional. He had no way of knowing that his target was not the simple, uneducated person he assumed, or that his mockery was about to trigger consequences that would fundamentally change his understanding of respect, dignity, and the true meaning of strength and intelligence. Victor's mockery reached new heights of cruelty as he began performing what he apparently considered a comedic imitation of James's Scottish accent for the entertainment of nearby tourists. His performance was loud, exaggerated, and deliberately offensive, incorporating stereotypes about Scottish people that revealed both his ignorance and his malicious intent to humiliate the guard who had simply tried to help him with directions. The Russian businessman seemed to feed off the discomfort he was creating, interpreting the shocked silence of other tourists as appreciation for his supposed wit and superiority. He made increasingly crude comments about James's background, education, and intelligence, apparently believing that his expensive clothes and obvious wealth gave him the right to treat a working soldier with contempt and disrespect. James continued to maintain his professional composure, though the effort was becoming increasingly difficult as Victor's insults became more personal and vicious. His military training had prepared him for many challenges, including dealing with hostile civilians. But the systematic nature of this verbal assault was testing his self-control in ways he had not expected during what should have been a routine ceremonial duty. The crowd of tourists watching the confrontation had begun to react with visible anger and disgust at Victor's behavior. Several people made comments about his rudeness and lack of respect, while others began taking photographs and videos of the incident with their phones. The atmosphere in the courtyard had shifted from the usual pleasant tourist experience to something much more tense and uncomfortable. Victor noticed the crowd's attention and seemed to interpret it as encouragement for his performance, escalating his mockery even further by suggesting that Scottish soldiers were inferior to Russian military personnel. His comments revealed not only cultural prejudice but also a fundamental misunderstanding of military service and the sacrifices made by those who chose to defend their countries rather than simply pursue wealth and personal gain. What Victor could not have known was that James MacLeod was far from the simple, uneducated person he was mockingly portraying. The young Scotsman held a degree in international relations from the University of Edinburgh, which he had earned before joining the military. He was fluent in 4 languages, including Russian, which he had learned during his intelligence training and used during classified operations in Eastern Europe. James had also completed advanced training in psychological operations and interrogation techniques, skills that had been crucial during his deployment to Afghanistan, where he had worked with local populations and gathered intelligence from captured enemy combatants. His understanding of human psychology and motivation was sophisticated and professionally developed, giving him insights into Victor's behavior that went far beyond what the arrogant businessmen could have imagined. The guard's patience was finally tested beyond its limits when Victor began making specific comments about James's family and background, using terms and references that revealed he was not just being casually rude, but was deliberately trying to cause maximum psychological harm. The personal nature of the attack crossed lines that even military discipline could not easily accommodate. James had been carefully observing Victor throughout the confrontation, his intelligence training allowing him to gather significant information about the Russian's background, personality, and vulnerabilities. Victor's expensive clothing, watch, and accessories suggested wealth, but his behavior patterns and speech indicated insecurity and a need for validation that could be systematically exploited by someone with the right knowledge and skills. Turning point came when Victor made a particularly crude comment about Scottish women, apparently believing that his status as a wealthy foreigner gave him license to insult not just James personally, but his entire cultural heritage and family background. The comment was crude, sexually explicit, and designed to provoke a reaction that might get the guard in trouble with his superiors, instead of the angry outburst that Victor was clearly hoping to provoke. James responded with something completely unexpected. In perfect, fluent Russian, he began speaking directly to Victor in his native language, his tone calm and professional, but carrying undertones that immediately changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. James's Russian was not just conversationally fluent, but demonstrated the sophisticated vocabulary and cultural understanding that came from professional intelligence, training, and operational experience. His accent was flawless. His choice of words and phrases revealed knowledge of Russian society and business culture that caught Victor completely off guard. The effect on Victor was immediate and dramatic. His confident smirk disappeared as he realized that the simple Scottish soldier he had been mocking was not only highly educated, but possessed language skills that suggested intelligence training and possibly operational experience in Russia or other former Soviet territories. The power dynamic of the confrontation had shifted completely in a matter of seconds. James continued speaking in Russian, his words carefully chosen to demonstrate not just his linguistic abilities, but his understanding of Russian culture, its business practices, and social structures. He made subtle references that indicated familiarity with Moscow's business environment and the types of activities that typically generated the kind of wealth that Victor was displaying through his expensive accessories. The crowd of tourists, while unable to understand the Russian conversation, could clearly see that something dramatic had changed in the interaction. Victor's arrogant confidence had evaporated, replaced by obvious shock and growing concern as he realized that his assumptions about the guard had been completely wrong, and that he might have seriously misjudged the situation he had created. Other tourists began taking more photographs and videos, sensing that they were witnessing something significant and potentially embarrassing for the Russian businessman who had been so confident and cruel just moments before. The tables had turned completely, and Victor was beginning to understand that his mockery had been directed at someone far more formidable than he had realized. James's fellow guards, while maintaining their ceremonial positions, had noticed the dramatic change in the confrontation and were watching with professional interest as their colleague demonstrated skills and abilities that went far beyond typical ceremonial duties. The pride and respect they felt for James was evident in their bearing, even as they maintained their required discipline and composure. James continued his response in flawless Russian, but now his words carried a subtle edge that demonstrated not just linguistic fluency, but deep knowledge of Russian business culture and the specific methods used by wealthy oligarchs to accumulate and maintain their fortunes. His comments were carefully crafted to let Victor know that he understood exactly what kind of businessman he was dealing with. Without making direct accusations that could create diplomatic complications, the transformation in Victor was remarkable to witness. The arrogant, mocking businessman who had been entertaining himself at James's expense just minutes earlier now stood frozen with shock and growing alarm as he realized that his assumptions about the guard's intelligence and background had been completely wrong. His face had gone pale, and his hands were trembling slightly as the implications of the situation began to dawn on him. James spoke about Moscow's construction industry with specific knowledge that could only have come from professional intelligence briefings or operational experience in Russia. He mentioned names of locations, business practices, and regulatory structures that were not widely known outside of certain circles. making it clear that his understanding of Victor's world went far beyond casual tourist knowledge or academic study. The crowd of tourists watching the exchange could not understand the Russian conversation, but they could clearly see the dramatic reversal that had taken place. Victor's confident swagger had completely disappeared, replaced by obvious nervousness and what appeared to be genuine fear. Several people continued recording the incident, sensing that they were witnessing something significant and potentially historic. Victor attempted to regain some composure by switching back to English and trying to minimize the situation. But his voice now carried a tremor that had not been present during his earlier mockery. He mumbled something about making a mistake and began looking around desperately for an escape route, clearly wanting to end the confrontation as quickly as possible. James was not finished demonstrating the extent of his knowledge and capabilities. Still speaking in Russian, he began discussing specific aspects of construction contracts and regulatory compliance that made Victor's eyes widen with genuine alarm. The guard's information was detailed and current, suggesting access to intelligence, sources that went far beyond what a simple ceremonial soldier should possess. The psychological impact on Victor was devastating as he began to understand that he had not just insulted a random guard, but had potentially drawn the attention of someone with connections to British intelligence services and detailed knowledge of Russian business operations. The casual mockery that had seemed so amusing just minutes earlier now appeared to have been a catastrophic error in judgment. James then switched back to English, but his accent now seemed different somehow, more controlled and deliberately modulated. He spoke with quiet authority about the importance of treating all people with respect, regardless of their background or perceived social status, and suggested that true education and sophistication were demonstrated through behavior rather than expensive clothing or crude displays of wealth. The guard's words were measured and professional, but they carried implications that made Victor increasingly uncomfortable as he realized that his behavior had been witnessed and potentially recorded by someone with the knowledge and connections to make his life very difficult. The power dynamic that had seemed so clear when Victor was mocking a simple soldier had been completely reversed. Other tourists in the area had begun to recognize that they were witnessing something extraordinary, and several began approaching to congratulate James on his professional handling of the situation and to express their disgust with Victor's earlier behavior. Their comments made it clear that Victor's reputation among the tourist group was now completely destroyed, and his expensive tour experience had been ruined by his own arrogance. Victor made several attempts to apologize and minimize the situation, but his efforts were clumsy and obviously insincere. It's motivated more by fear of consequences than genuine remorse for his behavior. James accepted the apologies with professional courtesy, but made it clear that respect was something that had to be demonstrated consistently, not just offered when someone realized they had made a serious mistake. The Russian businessman began backing away from the confrontation, clearly desperate to escape the situation he had created through his own arrogance and cultural insensitivity. His expensive suit and accessories, which had been symbols of his superiority just minutes earlier, now seemed to mark him as a target for ridicule and contempt from the other tourists who had witnessed his humiliation. James returned to his ceremonial duties with quiet dignity, having demonstrated that true strength and intelligence could not be judged by accents, backgrounds, or social status. His professional composure throughout the confrontation had shown the other tourists what real class and sophistication looked like. In stark contrast to Victor's crude display of wealth without substance, the incident quickly became the talk of the tourist group, with people sharing videos and photographs of Victor's humiliation on social media platforms. The story began spreading online as an example of karma and justice, showing how arrogance and prejudice could backfire spectacularly when directed at someone who possessed both the knowledge and skills to respond effectively. Victor spent the remainder of his castle tour trying to avoid attention and minimize contact with other tourists, but his reputation had been permanently damaged by his own behavior. The expensive vacation that was supposed to demonstrate his sophistication and worldliness had instead revealed him to be an ignorant bully who lacked the basic decency to treat service personnel with respect. James's fellow guards had witnessed enough of the exchange to understand that their colleague had handled a difficult situation with exceptional professionalism and skill. The incident reinforced their respect for James and demonstrated why the selection process for Royal Guard positions was so rigorous, requiring not just physical capabilities, but intelligence, education, and psychological resilience. The confrontation had become a teaching moment for everyone present, showing that assumptions based on accents, uniforms, or apparent social status could be dangerously wrong, and that treating others with respect was not just morally right, but practically wise. When dealing with people whose backgrounds and capabilities were unknown, the aftermath of the confrontation continued to unfold as word of Victor's humiliation spread throughout the tourist group and began reaching the castle's administrative staff. Several tour guides had witnessed portions of the incident and were discussing it among themselves, expressing admiration for James's professional handling of the situation and disgust with Victor's behavior. The story was already becoming legendary among the staff, who dealt with difficult tourists on a regular basis. Victor retreated to a corner of the courtyard, desperately trying to contact his tour coordinator to arrange an early departure from the castle. His phone calls were conducted in hushed, urgent Russian as he apparently tried to explain the situation to someone back in Moscow. Though his nervous glances toward James suggested that he was very aware of being potentially monitored and understood by someone he had seriously underestimated. The videos and photographs taken by other tourists had begun appearing on social media platforms within minutes of the confrontation, accompanied by descriptions of Victor's rude behavior and the guards' brilliant response. The hashtags #RoyalGuardJustice and #KarmaInAction began trending as the story spread across different platforms, reaching audiences far beyond those who had witnessed the incident directly. James continued his ceremonial duties with the same professionalism he had shown throughout his career, but other tourists now approached him with obvious respect and admiration. Several people thanked him for his service and complimented him on his handling of the difficult situation, while others asked for photographs with the guard who had become an internet sensation without seeking or wanting the attention. The castle's security personnel had been made aware of the incident. Through their routine monitoring of tourist activities and potential disturbances, Captain Williams, the officer in charge of security operations, reviewed the situation and commended James for maintaining military discipline and professionalism, while effectively neutralizing a potentially disruptive situation without escalating to physical confrontation. Victor's tour guide, Maria Santos, approached him with obvious disapproval and informed him that several other tourists in their group had complained about his behavior and requested that he be removed from the remainder of the tour. Her professional courtesy could barely conceal her disgust with his conduct. She made it clear that his actions had created problems that extended far beyond his personal humiliation. The incident had attracted the attention of British intelligence services who routinely monitored activities at royal locations and maintained awareness of foreign nationals whose behavior suggested potential security concerns. Victor's obvious wealth, Russian nationality, and aggressive behavior toward military personnel had triggered automated review protocols that would result in closer scrutiny of his activities and background. James was quietly approached by a plainclothes, a security officer who congratulated him on his handling of the situation and asked for a brief report on Victor's specific comments and behavior. The officer's questions suggested that the incident was being treated as more than just a tourist complaint, and that Victor's actions might have consequences that extended beyond simple embarrassment. The story continued to gain momentum on social media as more details about James's background and qualifications became known through military personnel who had served with him and were proud to share information about his education, language skills, and operational experience. Victor's assumption that he was mocking an uneducated soldier was being thoroughly debunked by people who knew the truth about James's impressive credentials. Victor received a phone call from someone in Moscow who was apparently very angry about the international attention his behavior was generating. Based on his increasingly desperate and apologetic responses in Russian, His conversation suggested that his business associates were concerned about the negative publicity and its potential impact on their operations and reputation. The tour group's departure from the castle became another source of humiliation. For Victor, as other tourists made their feelings known through cold stares and pointed comments about respect and proper behavior. His expensive clothing and accessories, which had been intended to project success and superiority, now seemed to mark him as a target for contempt and ridicule. James's commanding officer, Colonel Morrison, arrived at the castle to personally review the situation and ensure that proper protocols had been followed. After speaking with witnesses and reviewing the security footage, he commended James for exemplary conduct under difficult circumstances and noted that the incident demonstrated the high caliber of personnel serving in Royal Guard positions. The international media had begun picking up the story from social media posts, with several news outlets contacting the Ministry of Defense for official comments about the incident. The story was being framed as an example of British military professionalism and the dangers of making assumptions about people based on their accents or apparent backgrounds. Victor's hotel in London received several complaints from other guests, who had seen the viral videos and recognized him as the rude tourist who had embarrassed himself and his country at Windsor Castle. The hotel management was put in the uncomfortable position of dealing with a guest who had become a source of negative attention and potential problems for their establishment. The incident had created ripple effects that extended far beyond the original confrontation, with Victor's behavior becoming a case study in cultural insensitivity and the importance of treating all people with respect, regardless of their perceived social status. Educational websites and cultural training programs began using the story as an example of how prejudice and arrogance could backfire spectacularly. James continued to receive messages of support and admiration from fellow service members, veterans, and civilians who had been inspired by his professional response to provocation. The incident had become a symbol of military professionalism and the importance of maintaining dignity even when faced with deliberate disrespect and humiliation. Victor's business associates in Moscow were reportedly furious about the negative international attention his behavior had generated, particularly given their company's efforts to improve their reputation and expand into European markets. The viral video had become associated with Russian business culture in ways that were damaging to their broader commercial interests and diplomatic relationships. The confrontation had demonstrated that in the modern world of social media and instant global communication, bad behavior could have immediate and far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond the original incident. Victor's moment of cruel amusement had transformed into a permanent digital record of his character and values that would follow him indefinitely. Within 24 hours of the incident at Windsor Castle, Viktor Petrov had become one of the most recognizable faces on the internet for all the wrong reasons. The viral video of his humiliation had been viewed millions of times across multiple platforms, generating thousands of comments that ranged from mockery to serious discussions about prejudice, respect, and the dangers of making assumptions about people based on their accents or backgrounds. Major news outlets across Europe and North America had picked up the story, framing it as an example of instant karma and the importance of treating service personnel with respect. The contrast between Victor's arrogant mockery and James's professional, educated response had resonated with audiences worldwide, particularly those who had experienced similar prejudice based on their accents, backgrounds, or occupations. Victor's business empire in Moscow was experiencing serious complications as a result of the international attention. Several European companies that had been considering partnerships with his construction firm had quietly withdrawn their interest, citing concerns about corporate image and cultural sensitivity. The viral video had become associated with his company's brand in ways that were damaging their expansion plans and reputation. The Russian embassy in London had received numerous complaints about Victor's behavior from British citizens who viewed his actions as representative of broader Russian attitudes toward British culture and military service. Diplomatic officials were forced to issue statements distancing the Russian government from Victor's personal conduct while emphasizing respect for British traditions and institutions. James McLeod found himself dealing with unwanted celebrity status as media outlets sought interviews about the incident and his background. He declined all media appearances, preferring to maintain his privacy and continue his military duties without the distraction of publicity. His commanding officers supported his decision and implemented additional security measures to protect him from overeager journalists and social media attention. The incident had sparked broader discussions about accent discrimination and the prejudices that people faced based on their regional speech patterns. Linguistic experts and social psychologists were using Victor's behavior as an example of how accent-based prejudice revealed deeper cultural biases and assumptions about intelligence, education, and social status. Victor's expensive London hotel had quietly asked him to check out early after other guests, complained about his presence and the negative attention it was bringing to their establishment. Several luxury venues that he had planned to visit during his tour had canceled his reservations, citing security concerns and the potential for disruptions from protesters or media attention. The Royal Guard's training programs began using the incident as a case study in professional conduct under pressure, with James's response being analyzed and praised as an example of how proper military bearing and education could be more powerful than physical force in neutralizing difficult situations. His handling of the confrontation had become a teaching tool for military personnel worldwide. Intelligence services in both Britain and Russia had taken note of the incident for different reasons. British authorities were impressed by James's demonstration of skills and knowledge that validated their investment in military education and training, while Russian services were reportedly concerned about the negative international attention being generated by one of their citizens. Victor's social media accounts, which had previously featured posts about his wealth and lifestyle, were deactivated after being flooded with negative comments and memes mocking his behavior at the castle. The digital footprint of his humiliation had become so extensive that professional reputation management firms had informed him that cleaning up his online image would be extremely difficult and expensive. The story had inspired copycat incidents, where other service personnel shared their own experiences with rude or prejudiced treatment from tourists and customers. These accounts had created a broader conversation about the importance of treating working people with respect, regardless of their accents, uniforms, or perceived social status. Educational institutions began incorporating the incident into their cultural sensitivity and communication courses, using it as an example of how prejudice and arrogance could backfire when directed at people whose backgrounds and capabilities were unknown. The story had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of making assumptions based on stereotypes and superficial observations. Victor's tour group had completed their British vacation without him, with other participants reporting that his early departure had dramatically improved the atmosphere and enjoyment of their experience. Several tourists had posted positive reviews of James's professionalism and the quality of their Windsor Castle visit, specifically mentioning how well the incident had been handled by military personnel. The incident had generated unexpected benefits for military recruitment efforts, with several young people citing James's example as inspiration for their own decisions to pursue military careers. The demonstration of how military service could provide education, training, and opportunities for personal development had countered negative stereotypes about soldiers and military life. James's hometown of Glasgow had embraced him as a local hero, with newspapers and community leaders praising his representation of Scottish values in education. The incident had become a source of pride for his community and had generated positive attention for Scottish military service members and their contributions to British defense. The viral nature of the story had created lasting consequences for Victor that extended far beyond his original vacation plans. His behavior had become permanently associated with his name and image in ways that would affect his business relationships, travel experiences, and personal reputation for years to come. British military officials had used the incident to highlight the high educational standards and professional capabilities of modern service personnel, countering outdated stereotypes about soldiers being uneducated or lacking sophisticated skills. James's response had become an example of how military training developed both character and capabilities that served personnel throughout their careers. The confrontation at Windsor Castle had evolved from a simple tourist incident into a global conversation about respect, prejudice, and the importance of treating all people with dignity, regardless of their backgrounds or accents. Victor's moment of cruel amusement had created lasting consequences that would continue to affect both men's lives in ways neither could have anticipated when the encounter began. 3 months after the encounter at Buckingham Palace, Tommy Williams sat in the same hospital room where his story began. But everything about his situation had fundamentally changed. The honorary Royal Guard pin was proudly displayed on his bedside table next to Michael's military gloves. His plastic soldier now shared space with dozens of letters and gifts from supporters around the world. Most importantly, his latest medical tests showed significant improvement in his condition. His oncologist cautiously optimistic about his long-term prognosis. The psychological transformation that began with Michael's gesture had continued to strengthen Tommy's resilience and determination throughout his subsequent treatments. Dr. Martinez documented notable improvements in Tommy's cooperation with medical procedures, his appetite, sleep patterns, and overall attitude toward his recovery. While she was careful not to attribute his medical progress solely to the encounter with the guard, she acknowledged that the positive emotional impact had likely contributed to his improved outcomes. Michael Davies had faced a formal military tribunal regarding his breach of protocol, but the unprecedented nature of the situation and the overwhelmingly positive public response had influenced the proceedings in his favor. Colonel Whitfield had ultimately decided that while Michael's actions technically violated regulations, they exemplified the highest ideals of military service and compassion that the Royal Guard represented to the public. The disciplinary review had resulted in a formal reprimand being placed in Michael's personnel file, but it was accompanied by a commendation for extraordinary compassion and public service that would likely benefit his future military career. The decision established a precedent that military personnel could show appropriate discretion in exceptional circumstances involving seriously ill children or other vulnerable individuals. Tommy's story had continued to spread internationally, inspiring similar acts of kindness from military personnel, police officers, and other public servants around the world. The hashtag Honorary Guard had evolved into a broader movement encouraging people to recognize and support children facing serious illnesses, creating a global network of compassion and encouragement that extended far beyond Tommy's original experience. The Williams family had been invited to numerous events and ceremonies honoring Tommy's courage and Michael's compassion, including a special reception at the palace where Tommy met other members of the Royal Guard and learned more about their traditions. In history, these experiences had provided Tommy with a sense of purpose and belonging that strengthened his identity beyond his illness and diagnosis. Sarah Williams had become an advocate for other families dealing with childhood cancer, sharing her experiences and the lessons learned from Tommy's journey. She spoke at conferences and support group meetings about the importance of hope, the power of community support, and the ways that unexpected kindness could transform the most difficult circumstances. Her advocacy work had become a source of healing and purpose for the entire family. David Williams had returned to work with renewed energy and perspective, his experience with Tommy's illness having taught him about the importance of cherishing every moment and the power of human connection. His co-workers had rallied around the family throughout Tommy's treatment, providing both practical support and emotional encouragement that strengthened their community bonds. The charitable organizations that had reached out to Tommy's family had provided significant support for his ongoing medical expenses and had featured his story in their fundraising efforts for childhood cancer research. The attention generated by his encounter with Michael had resulted in substantial donations that would benefit many other families facing similar challenges. Multiplying the impact of that single moment of compassion, Tommy had been declared officially cancer-free 6 months after the palace encounter, though he would continue to require regular monitoring and follow-up care for years to come. The announcement of his remission had been celebrated by thousands of supporters worldwide who had followed his journey through social media updates and news reports, creating a virtual celebration that spanned continents and cultures. Michael and Tommy had maintained a friendship that enriched both of their lives, with the guard visiting the hospital regularly and Tommy attending special military ceremonies as an honored guest. Their relationship had become a symbol of the bonds that could form between people from different backgrounds. When they recognized their shared humanity and common values, the encounter had also inspired changes in Royal Guard training and protocols. With new guidelines established for appropriate interactions with seriously ill children and other vulnerable individuals, the military recognized that their ceremonial role included opportunities for positive community engagement that could enhance their public service mission while maintaining appropriate military standards. Tommy's school had created a special program called Tommy's Heroes, recognized students who showed courage in facing personal challenges or supporting classmates dealing with difficulties. The program had become a model for other schools, spreading the message that heroism comes in many forms, and that everyone has the potential to make a difference in someone else's life. The plastic soldier that had started Tommy's fascination with the Royal Guard had been donated to a military museum, where it was displayed alongside the story of how one child's dream and one soldier's compassion had created a moment that touched millions of people. The exhibit had become one of the museum's most popular attractions, inspiring visitors to consider their own opportunities for kindness and service. Dr. Martinez had documented Tommy's case in medical literature as an example of how positive psychological interventions could complement traditional cancer treatment, contributing to research that might help other young patients facing similar diagnoses. The scientific community had begun paying more attention to the role of emotional support and meaningful experiences in pediatric cancer recovery. Years later, when Tommy had grown into a healthy teenager who carried no visible signs of his childhood illness, he would still wear Michael's gloves during important moments in his life. The encounter at Buckingham Palace had become the defining moment that taught him about courage, compassion, and the power of human connection to transform even the most difficult circumstances. The story of Tommy Williams and Michael Davies had become a lasting testament to the idea that sometimes the smallest gestures could create the most profound changes, proving that true heroism was not found only on battlefields or in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments when people chose to reach out to others with kindness and recognition. Their encounter had reminded the world that we all have the power to be someone's hero, simply by choosing to see their worth and acknowledge their courage in the face of life's greatest challenges.